So this morning, the first panel we're going to have, we're going to have a duo. I'm not here to take part. I'm here simply as a timekeeper, a referee, and I'm going to fall on the grenade so that you don't have to ask the stupid and silly questions. I'll ask them, so to save you the embarrassment. So that's my excuse. So we have two very distinguished guests this morning. Hannan, who's the Emeritus Professor of Philosophy from the University of Iceland, and Daniel Hannan, what's they say, distinguished parliamentarian, member of the House of Lords. Is that still, they're still doing that, are they? And former member of the European Parliament, which they're not still doing, I know that. So we're going to have a couple of presentations then. I should imagine they will respond to each other, not in the manner of a boxing match, but in a friendly engagement. You are very welcome, obviously, to contribute and to ask questions and to make observations. And if silence should descend, I shall throw myself in the middle of it all and ask something. But who's going first? Sure.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you all here. I came across first Burkeanism and then Burke himself at a fairly impressionable age. My introduction to Burkean thinking came from the great Roger Scruton, who met me at a particularly impressionable age. I was 16. He was speaking at my school philosophy society. It was purely random chance. He happened to own a farmhouse nearby, which he'd bought with the proceeds of a successful lawsuit against a libelous newspaper. His talk was not about politics at all. Contrary to the impression you would get nowadays, he mainly didn't talk about current affairs. He was an academic philosopher, and his talk was actually about Wittgenstein and language games, which, the first time you hear it, is a fairly vertiginous subject to try and get your head around. And so when he'd finished, we were a bunch of 16-year-olds, there was that rather awkward moment where the teacher in charge asks for questions and no one can think of anything to say. And so, more to break an awkward silence than for any other reason, I thrust my paw into the air and I said, Professor Scruton, what do you see as the role of a conservative intellectual in today's society? And he, blinking diffidently behind his glasses in that rather charming and hesitant manner of his, he said, the role of a conservative intellectual is to reassure the people that their prejudices are true. And I've struggled for the rest of my life to come up with a better one-sentence encapsulation of Burkean philosophy, and I can't do it. Now, of course, Roger was using prejudice in the same sense that Burke himself did. Nowadays, the word prejudice has become a rough synonym for being mean to minorities or women or something, right? But he was using it in the exact sense you prejudge a new situation on the basis of past experience. You may not have been here before, but the chances are a million other people have, and they will have probably worked out what to do, so default to what Burke called the wisdom of your ancestors. And that's a theme that informs everything he says on almost every subject, including foreign policy and including the formation of governments. I was introduced to Burke himself only a couple of years later. I was a student, it was my first year as an undergraduate, and I was reading the very copy of the Reflections on the French Revolution, which John O'Sullivan mentioned yesterday. John talked about Conor Cruise O'Brien's introduction to that edition, in which the cruiser observes that a lot of his students are astonished when they learn that the greatest ever takedown of autocratic government was written before the terror had begun. And I was that student. I mean, I've actually brought it along out of nostalgia. This was my copy that I had with me at the beginning of 1991. And I'd read the text before I read the introduction. And I remember my utter astonishment. It takes an epistolary form. It's a letter to a young French aristocrat. And I remember coming across this passage quite early on where he talks about your captive king. And it was at that moment that it hit me that all of the horrors of the French Revolution lay in the future. that the regicide hadn't happened yet, that the repressions hadn't happened, the whole of the atrocities in the Vendée, that this was all invisible to everyone except Burke. He saw the whole thing coming in this extraordinary way. He could peer into the future like some Irish vate and descry what was going to happen, invisible as it was to all of his contemporaries. In fact, the reaction when Burke wrote this was general impatience. Oh, God, he's off again. He's on one of his why does he have to be so monomaniacal? And he was ultimately vindicated only because his predictions all came true. Now, on what basis could he foresee what was coming? Well, at the time, it seems incredible this, but in early 1991, it wasn't yet completely obvious that the Cold War was over. I know that sounds a bit strange today, but in the atmosphere of that time, there were still all sorts of very clever Cold War hawks arguing that the Soviet Union was still there and that the withdrawal from Central Europe was a kind of massive deception, a maskirovka, and that we needed to be ready for whatever came next. And I was, of course, like everyone of my age, I was marinated in that whole Cold War atmosphere. And so Burke's lines about tyranny and about the nature of systems that do not recognize the authority of established government or the claims of territorial jurisdiction or national sovereignty rang very true. Karl Marx wrote about the spectre haunting Europe, but here, 60, 70 years earlier, was Burke first conjuring that spectre. Out of the tomb of the murdered monarchy in France has arisen a vast, tremendous, unformed spectre, in far more terrific guise than any which ever yet have overpowered the imagination and subdued the fortitude of man. Going straight forward to its end, unappalled by peril, unchecked by remorse, despising all common maxims and all common means, that hideous phantom overpowered those who could not believe it was possible she could exist at all. And by the way, if anyone wonders why, as an 18-year-old, I was reading Burke on a Greyhound bus and staring in astonishment at my fellow passengers, it's the prose. It draws you in. He could write about any subject. He was one of those very fortunate authors who has this ability to make the most quotidian things fascinating. It's like George Orwell. He could write about how to make a cup of tea. He actually literally did. Orwell wrote a great article called How to Make a Cup of Tea. You think it's going to be some satire. It's not. It's actually just about how to make a cup of tea, but it's every bit as compelling as what he wrote about Marxism. And here it seems to me the Cold War may be over, but here is somebody who has an antidote to every utopian ideology that claims to be bigger than the nation-state, that presumes that it can trample across those vessels of liberty because it sees some great utopian future. And Burke, this wasn't in the reflections, it was in a letter, but it was. I just think this is the ultimate case against utopianism of any kind. He wrote, "I have no great opinion of that sublime, abstract, metaphysic, reversionary, contingent humanity, which in cold blood can subject the present time and those whom we daily see and converse with to immediate calamities in favour of the future and uncertain benefit of persons who exist only in idea." Isn't that the refutation of every kind of utopian doctrine that says that you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs? Burke makes not only the obvious observation that human beings are not eggs, but also points out that the omelette almost never emerges. Now, it can take all sorts of different forms. Sometimes it takes the form of aggressive and malign form like religious fundamentalism or Islamism today. Sometimes it takes a much more peaceful form like the belief that all of the nations of Europe can be merged together and forged into a single new nationality. But always the utopianism, the reluctance to deal with what's there, the refusal to recognize the realities of human nature runs up against that Burkean objection. Dr. Johnson, the greatest Tory of his age, wrote of Burke, the greatest Whig of his age, that he envied him above all his consistency. And indeed, his consistency is there, even though many of his subsequent detractors claimed that he'd, as it were, swapped sides and gone over to the establishment. By the way, this calumny began with Karl Marx. Karl Marx loathed Burke for obvious reasons. And he argued that he'd been a perfectly good liberal Whig who'd supported the American colonies, had supported the rights of India, had supported the rights of Ireland, and then had, as it were, gone over to the other side, Marx suggested, for pecuniary reasons. But in fact, the consistency is there throughout. In all of those cases, you see Burke championing the evolved, the natural, the organic, as against the planned, the imposed, and the centralized. In the case of the American colonies and of Ireland, he wanted to recognize what was there and not have some outside power presuming to know better. In Yeats's Seven Sages, he sees this very clearly. American colonies, France, India, and Ireland harried, and Burke's great melody against it. The cruiser then turned the great melody into the name of his book, but I think the best book on Burke, certainly until Jesse Norman's new biography, which is different in form and astonishingly powerful. There was, throughout all of those contentious issues that he faced as a writer and a politician, this belief in what we would now recognize as the established claims of custom and of nationhood. The one bit of Burke that everyone can quote, or at least that everyone is aware of, the people who haven't read Burke, is his letter to the electors of Bristol, right, where he says, I'm your representative, not your delegate, and your representative would betray rather than serving you if he sacrificed his judgment to your opinions, right? Everyone quotes that, especially politicians love to quote that when they're doing something unpopular. They never actually, or they very rarely tell the story right through to the end, which is that the electors of Bristol slung him out at the next opportunity. But the issue on which they slung him out is an interesting one. Burke was a champion of the commercial rights of Ireland, which at that time were restricted. And he could see that free commerce across the Irish Sea was in everyone's interest. And obviously it was in the interest of Ireland, but also it would be in the interest of his constituents in Bristol, albeit not in the interest of every vested interest and every producer. And that was why he said, look, I've got to try and do the right thing for everyone. He was a great free trader, which I'll come on to in a moment. We're talking in a session that's entitled Burke, Ireland and Britain. Actually, other than when you speak in this country, the Irishness of Burke is, I think, a rather neglected subject. Partly because it was a small part of his output, but it was a huge part of his upbringing. So I think there is a lingering belief among a lot of people that Burke, he spent his career in Britain, he wrote about Britain, he's thought to have been Anglo-Irish, which he wasn't, and his outlook was Whig and his worldview accordingly. But actually that takes very little account of the way he was brought up and the way in which his experience here shaped his response to the French Revolution and to the other great events of his day. So first of all, dealing with the idea, there was nothing Anglo about Burke. His mother was Catholic. Most of his family was Catholic. His cousins, they came in a great sort of troop and lived with him in Beaconsfield when he built his estate there, which I think is the ultimate proof. His father may have been brought up in a Catholic milieu. We don't know that. So the name Burke is Norman, but by then the Norman Irish were completely kind of Gaelicized. He went to a hedge school. The hedge school for the non-Irish people here was that there was an Anglican monopoly on education in Ireland at that time, and so the religious, the non-Anglican religions, both mainly the Catholics, but also the Presbyterians and the other dissenters, had to go and effectively what we would now call homeschool. They were called hedge schools. They weren't usually in hedges. They were usually in houses or barns. But something that as conservatives, I think we could recognise and applaud. I think his teacher was called Mahoney. I mean, he was somebody who was completely marinated in a way of looking at the world that was very different from that of the comfortable English Whig gentleman or patrician. And that gave him two advantages when the French Revolution started. And it allowed him to see something that the English oligarchy couldn't see. First of all, he didn't have that belief that was very widespread in England that revolution couldn't happen here. He'd come from a very different milieu where political violence was much closer to the surface. And indeed, he died just before the culmination of the United Irishmen Rising, which, of course, he had no time for at all. He thought it was the most subversive and quasi-Jacobin movement. But he was much more aware of the threat to liberty and property that would come from political violence. He knew that, as he put it, rage and frenzy can tear down in half an hour what prudence takes hundreds of years to build. But the second, and I think rather neglected aspect of Burke's Irish upbringing in terms of understanding his approach to the French Revolution is that he didn't make the mistake that, again, most of his Whig colleagues did in the first years of thinking, oh, good, écraser l'infâme, as it were. It's about time that we had some kind of reformation in France. If we get rid of popery and ignorance, then France will develop into a nice, liberal, sort of quasi-secular place where there's toleration and pluralism. He was quite happy to take his stand in defense of the Catholic Church because he could see what horrors would unfold when the established order was overtaken. And it took a long time for his colleagues in all parties to realize that, particularly his colleagues in his Whig faction. They were blinded by the promises of the French Revolution until almost too late. And of course, as a nation, we then spent the next quarter of a century in war one way or another against revolutionary France. He even foresaw in his reflections on the revolution how it would end. So writing in it was in a letter just after, I think in 1792, he says, "The day will come when a popular general arises who draws the eye of the soldiery on his own account, and in that day you've lost your whole republic." How did he foresee all of these things? Because he was applying his fundamental principle that if you betray human nature, if you go against the familiar and the tried, and you prefer abstract schemes, you end up with a lot of broken eggshells, but with no omelette at the end of it. I'd like to go back to one other thing that was mentioned in our opening session yesterday, which is Burke, if you like, as a fusionist. Right? We had a very interesting reminder, again from John O'Sullivan, about the beginnings of what we now think of as conservatism in the English-speaking sense in the 1950s, with Bill Buckley and the National Review and the people who gathered around him. Again, it takes quite an effort to see how recent that was, to think that before that, American political parties didn't really break down in any neat way on a left-right axis, that party allegiance in the United States was as much regional and hereditary as it was ideological. And the alignment that we now take for granted, where Russell Kirk and Buckley and all these people got together the various groups who were anti-socialist, whether they were libertarians or whether they were evangelicals or whether they were foreign policy hawks or whether they were strict constitutionalists, and said, look, we are facing a terrible threat, and our differences are now so trivial in the face of that threat that we should bury them. That, again, owed a great deal to Burke. He understood that when you're up against these great transnational ideologies, that the danger is that they have local fifth columnists. Let me read something else that he wrote. This is from the first letter on a regicide peace. "We're at war with a system which by its essence is inimical to all other governments, and which makes peace or war as peace or war may best contribute to their subversion. It is with an armed doctrine that we are at war. It has, by its essence, a faction of opinion and of interest and of enthusiasm in every country. To us, it's a colossus which bestrides our channel. It has one foot on a foreign shore and the other upon British soil. Thus advantaged, if it can exist at all, it must finally prevail." Right? Again, that applies to any one of these doctrines. Now, you might argue that the end of that immediate threat of the Cold War, which was still on when I read this book for the first time, has, if you like, meant that the conservative and liberal traditions no longer need to bury their differences. And we've seen this happen around the world, right? We've seen parties that were, thinkers that were thrust together by circumstance now separating out into their elemental forms. You see it in the US in the division between natcons and freecons. You see it in countries that have proportional representation systems in differing parties sitting in different places. Is there still a Burkean logic to burying our differences? Are we still up against a threat sufficiently severe that we should make common cause? John suggested yesterday that that threat was basically wokery. It was identity politics. And it is certainly true that woke is as offensive to the conservative as to the liberal traditions. The one because it tramples on all established practice, the other because it buries the individual within the collective. Is that strong enough? I don't know, but I will just say this. I see my friend James Orr, who runs the NatCon movement in the UK, and it's done through the Edmund Burke Foundation. Please look at what Burke himself would have thought. He was not. Russell Kirk used to say, "I've got more in common with socialists than with some of these economic libertarians." Burke would have never said that. Burke was a convinced economic liberal. The reason that he got himself kicked out as the MP in Bristol was not just that he had a sympathy for his relatives in Ireland, but also because he could see that protectionism is as bad for the people doing it as, in fact, worse for the people imposing it, as for the people upon whom or at whom it is being targeted. Here's what he wrote, actually quite late in life. So this I think, makes a nonsense of the idea that he kind of became more of a Tory in old age. To provide for us in our necessity is not in the power of government. It is in the power of government to prevent much evil. It can do little to promote positive good. Now, he went on, even when there was a famine caused by the wars against France, to argue in very Smithite terms that it would be a mistake for the government to intervene with direct food relief, not just on sort of moral grounds, but because it would be less efficient, that it would be better to allow the price mechanism to flourish, that if some profiteer goes and sells food at massively inflated costs, that's still more likely to get to the people who need it than some state bureaucracy trying to administer it. And he thought that, he wrote that right at the end of his life. It was published posthumously. This, by the way, shouldn't surprise us. He was a friend of Adam Smith when The Wealth of Nations was published. He wrote to Adam Smith saying that he was convinced of your solidity and truth. He thought it was the most profound book on economics that he'd read, and he believed that there was no more to be said. It was the last word. Here is, I think, the most, because he was so eloquent, he puts Adam Smith's arguments with a directness and an immediacy that even the sage of Kirkcaldy himself rarely managed. The benign and wise dispenser of all things obliges men, whether they will or not, in pursuing their selfish interest, to connect the general good with their own success. Isn't that the most perfect defense of a market economy? Right? We are hardwired to be suspicious of anything that has a profit motive, to see it as somehow greedy or selfish. But every other system replaces that profit motive with state coercion because there isn't any alternative. The market system is the only one that evolved in such a way as to allow people's nature, their desire for self-improvement, to be harnessed to socially productive aims, so that the way that you get ahead, the way that you get rich in a market-based society is not by sucking up to kings or commissars, but by providing a service to people around you. You cannot succeed without incidentally promoting the welfare of everyone else. Again, Burke could see that back in the 1790s. I'll leave you just with the way he described free trade. He said, the laws of commerce are the laws of nature and therefore the laws of God himself. I think you'll struggle to find a better fusionist than Burke. The coming together of the liberal and conservative, the Whig and Tory traditions in the face of socialism was the event that made possible the renaissance of anti-socialist forces in the West. And I'm afraid our job is not done. There is still that enemy, that colossus, with one foot on our own shore. If we think that we have the luxury of quarrelling among ourselves while the colossus inches closer and closer, then we do a disservice to ourselves and to our peoples. Never tire of reading this great sage. There's no, I think it was Harold Lasky who said there's no man of affairs who wouldn't benefit from a conversation with Burke on any subject before he pronounces upon it. Right? So he has reached beyond the core of the conservative right. And the reason for that is not just his eloquence, but the extraordinary timelessness of understanding that if we work with the grain of human nature, then all manner of peace and plenty is possible. But the moment we think that some group of people know better and therefore have the right to impose, that way lies utter destruction.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me here. It has a special significance for me because I come from Iceland, and the Icelanders are descended from the Irish and the Norse in the 9th century, and we have a lot of Irish blood in us, and we think very warmly of Ireland as being another North Atlantic island. So what I'm going to do here is to say a few words which are in my book, forthcoming book called North-South Conservative Liberalism, which is a study of the Danish poet Grundtvig and the Italian economist Einaudi. And I begin actually in the book by discussing the old Germanic liberal heritage, which was described 2,000 years ago by Tacitus when he gave an account of the self-management of the German tribes, how a law was interpreted and reformed slowly by folk assemblies in the Germanic countries, and how the kings were constrained by the folk assemblies. And then Montesquieu, actually, in the 18th century, said that the liberty of the English and the liberty that existed in Europe was more or less derived from the forests of Germany. And there was in Iceland Snorri Sturluson, who was what I would call a proto-liberal. What he did was describe law as similar to language, an idea that David Hume and Karl Menger and Edmund Burke also proposed later on. That law was essentially the rules that enable us to coordinate our behavior with one another. It is not given from above. It's really something that's evolved by those folk assemblies and by custom and tradition. And government by consent and the right to rebellion are both present in his chronicles of the Norwegian kings. There are, for example, a defense of private property in his account of Hákon the Good, who replaced Harald the Fair, who was the first person that established Norway. Hákon the Good, he gave back to people the property that Harald the Fair had expropriated from them, and he was applauded as a good king. And then there is a very interesting defense of free trade in his account of the wars between the Swedes and the Norwegians. The Swedes, they assembled in Uppsala, and they said to the king, "We do not want you to wage war against the Norwegians. We want the farmers in our West Gotland to be able to trade with the farmers in Norway and thus to supplement their life." A wonderful early statement of how free trade extends our material vision. And he also discussed what I have called Icelandic exceptionalism, because Iceland for 3 centuries didn't have any king. Apud illus non est rex, nisi tantum lex. That was what Adam from Bremen said about the Icelanders. They have no king but the law, which is really the same as in the pamphlets of libertarians in England, lex rex, no king but the law. And there is a speech that Snorri writes, obviously, where an Icelandic farmer, when the Norwegian king was trying to conquer or at least get a foothold on Iceland, he says, "It may be that this is a good king. I believe that. But we all know that kings are different. Some are good and some are bad, and therefore it is best for us to have no king." And Iceland was one of the very few countries that had no kings at that time. This was in the 11th century, early in the 11th century. And then we have the classical liberals, Locke and Hume and Smith. If we take them, yes, Locke and Hume and Smith. And in my book I point out that actually they were the authors of classical liberalism, but their classical liberalism, their theory, was really an articulation of political practices that were derived all the way from the Germanic tribes and had been firmed in England. Locke, for example, he proposed government by consent and right of rebellion. Hume, he described justice as the product of evolution, the response to scarcity, the niggardliness of nature, and limited altruism. And Smith had his wonderful, 2 powerful ideas in The Wealth of Nation: the coordination without commands, that we can have order without anybody ordering us around, and profit without loss, that we can trade to our mutual benefit. These are very powerful ideas, and to this day they are not understood, for example, by left-wing intellectuals. But this classical liberalism, which has been articulated by these 3 august English, British thinkers, was put to a test in the French Revolution, which failed. And my theory is that with the French Revolution, liberalism split into 2 branches. Burke, he saw earlier, as Daniel Hannan described very well, he saw earlier what was happening than anyone else. And we must never forget that Burke was a Whig. He supported the 1688 revolution by which James II was deposed, because he had gone too far in violating the rights and liberties, traditional liberties of people. And as was also brought out very well by Daniel Hannan, in the famous letters to the voters of Bristol, he was defending free trade, and it was free trade with Ireland that he was defending. Burke understood that the revolution in England in 1688 and the revolution in America in 1776, they were revolutions whose purpose it was to extend traditional liberties. They were in defense of traditional liberties and an endeavor to try to extend them. So they were, in a way, conservative revolutions. The French Revolution, on the other hand, was an attempt to reconstruct society according to some blueprint thought up by some intellectuals like Rousseau. So it was a totally different thing, and it would lead, as he said, to disaster. It would fail because it didn't take into account all the accumulated traditional knowledge that we possess and are to be found in our institutions, like the monarchy, like the church, like property, like the aristocracy, like democracy, like folk wisdom, and so on. So I think there were 2 branches of liberalism after 1789. The conservative liberalism of Burke, Constant, and Tocqueville, which is based upon limited government, private property, free trade, and respect for traditions. Evolution instead of revolution. And this conservative liberalism came into being as a response to the French Revolution, because the conservative liberals were against the French Revolution. Constant de Tocqueville, for example, they have very deep and profound thoughts about the French Revolution. It broke with traditions and destroyed intermediate institutions. This political tradition, what I've called conservative liberalism, was then continued in the 20th century by Hayek, Wilhelm Röpke, Michael Oakeshott, and Luigi Einaudi. Luigi Einaudi is the other person that I discuss very extensively in my book, because I'm contrasting Grundtvig and Einaudi, North and South liberalism. Then the other branch of liberalism is quite different nowadays, because it's split. And this is the liberalism of Tom Paine and John Stuart Mill and Leonard Hobhouse, John Maynard Keynes, Benedetto Croce, Bertil Ohlin. This is a liberalism that can be defined by open-mindedness, romantic individualism, rationalism, and restrictions on economic freedom. I think then what has been neglected, this is all fairly old stuff for you guys, but what I'm now going to turn to is something that you may never have seen, and that is the neglected tradition of Nordic conservative liberalism. And this is the liberalism of Anders Chydenius and Nikolai Grundtvig. And Chydenius, he wrote a book in 1765 which actually expressed the two twin ideas of coordination without commands and profits without losses 11 years before Adam Smith did so. He anticipated very clearly Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations as a deputy to the Swedish Diet. It's a very remarkable book. And he was not only a man of theory, he was also a man of action, because in the Swedish Diet he successfully fought for freedom of religion and freedom of the press. In fact, the first legal statutes for freedom of the press were passed in Sweden on his initiative. And Grundtvig, the poet, the Danish poet, very influential poet, 1/3 of the hymn book of Denmark are hymns by Grundtvig. He translated Snorri Sturluson, and he emphasized the Nordic cultural heritage, the legal certainty that characterizes the Nordic countries. He presented in 1848, when Denmark was challenged by the German alliance, German Federation, national liberalism. And he emphasized what Tocqueville and Constant and Burke had also done, intermediate institutions, a flourishing civil society between the state and the individual. And both Chydenius and Grundtvig rejected the French Revolution. They were conservative liberals. And we see here Eidsvoll, 1814. That is the Constituent Assembly of Norway in 1814. And it has not been noted by many people that the spirits of Snorri Sturluson and Adam Smith were present there in a way, because the Norwegians said, like the author of the Constitution, the Norwegian Constitution, which is the most liberal constitution in Europe at that time, and the second oldest constitution of the world after the American Constitution of 1789. Falsen, who was the author of the Constitution, he said, what we in Norway are really trying to do is to return to people like Håkon the Good, the old Nordic heritage. But also Adam Smith was present, because many of the delegates, they were disciples of Adam Smith, and actually the owner of the house was a friend of Adam Smith who had met him in Glasgow. and his nephew was then the Prime Minister of Norway. There was a direct connection between them and Adam Smith. There were 3 Norwegians who met Adam Smith, and then they were the people who arranged for the first foreign translation of the Wealth of Nations into Danish that came out 3 or 4 years after 1776. So this is not a fantasy of mine. This is well documented, both the influence of Snorri Sturluson and of Adam Smith on the Norwegian constitution, the most liberal constitution in Europe at the time. Grundtvig was a poet, a prolific poet, and so he was very influential in Denmark, not known anywhere else. Nobody knows who Grundtvig is outside of the Nordic countries. But I would like to quote to you a poem from 1832, just 2 lines, couplets. Freedom, our watchword, must be in the north, freedom for Loki as well as for Thor. This is very interesting, because those of you who know something about the northern myths know that Loki was a rogue god. He was a slanderer. He was what you would call a bad person, Loki. Thor was a hero with his hammer, a fighter, what you would call an alpha male. So Grundtvig was telling us that we have to recognize the freedom of people with views that we find despicable, abhorrent, unpleasant. Loki and Thor. It's a very interesting thought, and it is also, of course, expressed by, say, Rosa Luxemburg in her critique of Lenin. Freiheit ist immer die Freiheit des Andersdenkenden. Freedom is always the freedom of those who think differently, the dissidents. Because there is no problem with protecting the freedom of those who are with the authorities to be. Those who just pursue a conventional way of life, that's not a problem. The freedom is a freedom when you are a member of an unpopular minority or you have an unpopular opinion. So this is a very important poem by Grundtvig, and this shows what a tolerant society Denmark really was, and all the Nordic countries were tolerant societies. I would like to quote another poem from 1848, 2 lines, and it is, other people, all the members, who regard themselves as such, and thereby hangs a tale, because Denmark was a country, and the King of Denmark was also the Duke of Schleswig. The problem with Schleswig was that half of Schleswig, the northern part, was Danish-speaking and wanted to be Danes, and the southern part was German-speaking and they wanted to be Germans. And Grundtvig said, let us just divide Schleswig up between Denmark and Germany, or the German Confederation. Let people be where they want to be, which I think is an extremely interesting solution. And nobody took him seriously. The Danes wanted to take the whole of Schleswig and create a German-speaking minority. The German Confederation wanted to take the whole of Schleswig as well and create a Danish-speaking minority. But he wanted government by consent and nationality by plebiscites, just like Ernest Renan later in the 19th century. That is to say, nationality by choice, not by conquest or force. So that was, in my opinion, very interesting as a humane, liberal solution of the problem of conflict in territories. I would like, since I am here in Ireland, to make a comment about a classic research topic. There are 2 classic research topics. One is the difference between Australia and Argentina, and the other one is the difference between Denmark and Ireland in the 19th century, not in the 20th century, because Ireland has done so well in the 20th century, obviously. What was the key to the Danish success in the 19th century was that after the defeats, losing Norway in 1814 and Schleswig and Holstein in 1864, Denmark abandoned all dreams of military adventures and turned inwards. And one of the Danish poets, he wrote a poem, "Hvad udad tabes skal indad vindes," what is lost outside will be regained inside. And they began to develop their industry and their trade and opt for capitalism. And they developed a very flexible agricultural sector, which was helped by land reforms in the 18th century. And I think that there are three reasons why Denmark, they are very similar countries, Denmark and Ireland, as you can see if you look at the map and everything. There are three reasons why Denmark is more successful than Ireland. One is that Denmark was a nation state. She governed herself. She was not governed from London, let alone from Brussels. She was governed from Copenhagen. And the second is that there was greater social cohesion in Denmark than in Ireland. Less bitter cleavages of society. And this is not least because of the influence of Grundtvig, who emphasized intermediate institutions, spontaneous association, clubs, societies, collectives, and so on, and also the education of the common folk. And the third reason is that there was a better structure of property rights in land in Denmark than in Ireland. Then finally, I would like to propose that this is not only an interesting historical account of the Nordic liberalism, it has also some relevance to today's problems. Democracy requires civic education. And that was what Grundtvig provided with the people's high schools. And I think that's an idea that would be very relevant in developing countries of the world nowadays, where there is a lack of social cohesion and civic virtues that can be perhaps transmitted and taught in people's high schools. And the social cohesion in Denmark and all the Nordic countries is brought about by association, clubs, collectives, societies, congregations, private schools, and nations. I think actually that the Nordic nations are successful despite social democracy, not because of social democracy. The Nordic nations are successful because of three things: the rule of law, free trade, and social cohesion. And the social cohesion is what Grundtvig represented, really. And he was a nationalist, but he supported a non-aggressive nation state. And there were four elements that were very interesting in the Grundtvigian or Nordic conception of international relations. First, border changes by plebiscites. What happened in 1920 was that the regions of Schleswig voted whether they wanted to belong to Denmark or to Germany. And the northernmost region voted to belong to Denmark, and then the other two voted for Germany. And hence, the border was moved southwards, peacefully. And wouldn't this be a possible solution, for example, for Ukraine? Then peaceful secession. Norway seceded from Sweden in 1905, Finland seceded from Russia in 1917, and Iceland seceded from Denmark in 1918. This was not because these were enemies. The Norwegians just said, we are Norwegians, not Swedes, therefore we want our own state. The Finns said, we are not Russians, we are Finns, we want our own state. The Icelanders said, we are Icelanders, not Danes. They are wonderful people, the Danes, but civilized, well-meaning. But they are not us. We want to be ourselves. We are Icelanders. So peaceful secession. Autonomy on national enclaves. We had an example there in the Nordic countries. It was the Åland Islands. They were Swedish-speaking, And they wanted, after the Finnish independence of 1917, to belong to Sweden. They had a plebiscite, and a great majority wanted to belong to Sweden. This was referred to the International Court of Justice that said that sovereignty belonged to Finland, but only after the Finns had promised autonomy for the Åland Islands. And they did so, and now the Åland Islands are perfectly happy to be a part of Finland, even if they are Swedish-speaking, and feel themselves to be Swedish, have a Swedish identity. This is, of course, the same thing that happened in South Tyrol, that Mussolini tried to oppress the German-speaking part of Italy, and now the South Tyrolers, they are perfectly happy within Italy. So autonomy or national enclaves. And I said here, why can't we impose this solution on the Middle East conflict? I don't believe that there will be a two-state solution there, because you can't have a state that is sending rockets to you. But can't we have a sovereignty by Israel over the whole place, like Finland has the sovereignty over the Åland Islands, but national self-governing units there? Only a suggestion. I'm not solving the riddle of life or the problems of the world, but I think those are interesting ideas that have been successfully implemented in the Nordic countries. Then we have the last thing that I wanted to say. We have cooperation with minimal surrender of sovereignty in the Nordic countries, because over the years and decades, they have increased and intensified their cooperation, but it has been a spontaneous cooperation. They abolished the passports, they have a common labor market, they have mutual social benefits, they have coordination of legal statutes in the Nordic countries. Why can't we look at the Nordic Council as a model for Europe instead of the United States of America? Why don't we have a Europe of nation states, a family, not a prison? Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. So I'm going to kick off returning to the Irish context, because we're here. And just for those who aren't aware of Burke, he's often described as an Anglo-Irish philosopher or Anglo-Irish thinker. In the odd divisions that people make about the family of the Irish, Burke's father's side are Norman rather than English. They were at least gentry. They would have been landed, and after the wars in the 17th century, they would have supported the Stuarts. They would have supported James, and they largely lost their property. On his mother's side, his family were Nagels, who were minor Gaelic aristocracy in Munster. They still had some property, they still had some status, but they had lost a lot also, because in 1600, roughly 90% of the land in the country was held in the hands of Catholics. By 1700, that had gone from 90% to 10%. So first during the Tudor period under Elizabeth, then the Stuarts to a degree, but then particularly after the wars of the Confederacy and the Cromwellians, and then 1688 and 1690, the Battle of the Boyne, the defeat of James, and the triumph of William and Mary, there's a massive transfer of land. And Burke's family on both sides, Catholics on both sides, suffered for that. And I think, Daniel, we'll come to that in a minute, that's something that informs Burke and the way he looks at the world. So Burke comes in, he's very close to his mother, he has a difficult relationship with his father. The descriptions we have from his friends is that his father was a difficult man. He attends his first school with his Nagle relatives, which would have been a hedge school. His next school is in Ballator, which is a Quaker school, where he becomes great friends with Shackleton. Now, my point here is simply that if you look at his education, at no stage does he receive an Anglican education until he gets to Trinity. He doesn't experience any kind of proper formal Anglican catechesis. Now, I wouldn't for a moment, I don't think there's any reason to suggest that his Anglicanism is any sense faked. But I do wonder, and I'm going to have two questions for you on this. But first, on this point, I wondered when I was getting ready for this, reading some of Burke, whether his faith in Anglicanism, because Burke has very little interest, it seems to me, in engaging in debates about articles of dogma or points of theology. That's not something he likes. In fact, it's not that he's not interested, he actively dislikes it. Yeah. But he has great faith in Anglicanism as the established church. And I wonder, is that in a way because his primary faith is in the genius of the English Constitution? And the English Constitution, a central part of that, is based on the Anglican Church as the established church. And since he sees the genius of the Constitution, and the Anglican Church is a central part of it, therefore, in some sense, the Anglican Church must be true. So that's my first. I'm wondering if that's part of his Anglicanism. Because he's surrounded by either dissenters or Catholics. And if we look at the speech he gives at the Guildhall in Bristol, I mean, he talks about, that's a phrase you may have heard, where he says, I think, bad laws are the worst tyranny. And he talks about all of the negative consequences that the penal laws, the anti-Catholic laws, have had. But never doing so in the sense of either denigrating the truth of Anglicanism, or he talks about superstition and the Reformation as the greatest thing, but rather the moral effect that it has on the nation. So the second thing, the way he looks at the issue around, say, emancipation, obviously has to be affected by his family and his affection for the people he knows. But also, for example, in India, his attitude to what happens in India. Burke recognizes, I think I'm right in saying, the right of conquest. He accepts the right of conquest. But he says something which is, and I may be wrong, but I'm kind of curious. When he talks about conquest, he talks about the degree to which a conquest is settled, and maybe even legitimate, is the degree to which it's held in the memory of the people. So, for example, in England, nobody really was bothered much about the Saxon conquest of the Britons. Or indeed, everybody had pretty well got over the Norman conquest of the Saxons. Now, Burke had to be aware, coming from the family where he did, that who were keenly present, that they had lost. They were keenly aware of the conquest. The conquest had not been forgotten in Ireland. And yet I don't get any sense in his writing that he doubts the legitimacy of the state. So, first of all, the role of the church, and is it that sense that it derives from the genius of the Constitution, that's his principle guiding star. And the second thing, the way that he talks about not just the Irish issue, but, for example, about India, and maybe even America, is affected by his Irish experience.
Really, really good and interesting set of questions. Let's start with why is he called Anglo-Irish? Where does this come from? I think it's actually partly just abuse of language. I remember many years ago watching an edition of Question Time, BBC Question Time, and on the panel were Patrick Mayhew, who was then the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and Claire Short, who was then the Labour spokesman. And he was described as Anglo-Irish, and she was described as Irish, which is 180 degrees the wrong way around. Right? The Mayhews are properly Irish, the Shorts they came to Dublin with Cromwell. Right? But the reason they were described that way is because he was posh. And that I think is what sort of seeped into the consciousness as what the labels indicate. And so because Burke was Anglican and because he never wrote about, or very rarely wrote about it, given how, as you correctly say, how huge Ireland was in his making, it's a surprisingly small part of his output. He writes much more about India, America, France than he does about Ireland. So for all of those reasons, he's thought to be more British, and therefore this erroneous label is applied. He was completely Irish, as you say. The Burke's, it was a Norman name. It was the de Burgh, like the lady in Red Guy, right? But they, by Burke's time, were they'd become Catholic, they'd become Gaelic, they'd intermarried. So he was like Jeremy Mayhew, he was being mislabeled because of how he spoke. By the way, he never looked anything other than completely Irish to people in England. He, as one of his contemporaries say, you hear the flow of the Liffey every time he opens his mouth. Right? He never lost his accent.
Sorry, Augustine Birrell says that he was not only seen as being Irish, but he was seen as being, unusually in England, as being a typical Irishman.
Yeah.
In fact, the kind of Irishman that Englishmen will make a point, and occasionally Scotsmen too, of disliking.
Yes, although he wasn't disliked. I mean, it's given how clever he was and how he followed the arrow flight of his logic to some unusual places, it's amazing he wasn't more disliked.
But he had a talent for friendship.
Yes, he really did, including with a lot of Tories at that time. His political career was actually spectacularly unsuccessful given how brilliant he was, but in that sense, he was the template for a lot of people who came later. All the Tony Benns, the Enoch Powells, the people who were brilliant but incapable of compromise and couldn't therefore hold office for long. In fact, his most recent biographer, Jesse Norman, had a rather Burkean career in that he held only a very minor, which is, of course, exactly what his hero had done. But he was, without question, a lifelong Whig. He never really wavered in his party allegiance, and was seen as a Whig and a Liberal. Really, he only began to be adopted by Conservatives and by the Conservative Party as a hero at the beginning of the 20th century. Largely, actually, he was kind of reinterpreted by one of the Marquis of Salisbury's children, who was another Conservative MP in the Edwardian time. So being a Whig created, if you like, a tension. He was an absolutely sincere supporter of the Revolution of 1688. He thought that we had avoided tyranny and we had established the traditional rights of Parliament and therefore of the people. He saw it, as Hannan said, as a fundamentally conservative revolution, that there was a kind of foreign-inspired attempt to create an absolute monarchy, but that traditional rights had prevailed against it. But he could not have been unaware of the impact of that revolution in Ireland, where it sustained exactly the imbalance of land ownership and political power that Michael mentioned. He'd come from that community and he was well aware of that dichotomy. I think he saw first of all, what you say about his Anglicanism is interesting. His Anglicanism was a kind of compromise. It was a default, as it was for quite a few people. If you didn't have strong convictions, just go with what will make your life easier, right? I don't think this is particularly unusual. You can probably guess from my surname, and indeed my first name, my father's family was Irish Catholic. My mother's was Scots Presbyterian. I was baptized in the Church of England as an easy compromise because it was the easiest way of not having to think about it. Anglicanism is a remarkably undoctrinal faith for a lot of its adherents. It's probably the closest you can get to complete agnosticism while still being a Christian denomination. And it's striking that Burke doesn't ever talk about his relationship with his church. He does talk about his Christian principles, but how un-Burke-like not to talk about his little platoon, right? Mm-hmm. In every other context, Burke is hugely attached to the particularism of place and circumstance, except this. It's remarkable how whenever he's asked about religion, he talks in very general terms about Christianity. And I think that he saw in the political realignment that followed the French Revolution, so the party system had kind of collapsed under George III. There was a group calling themselves Whigs, which he was part of, but there were no people calling themselves Tories at that time, although there were, well, sorry, that's not right. There were Tories at that time, but there was no Tory party at that time. But a new party alignment was formed, or the old party alignment was rediscovered, initially on the basis of attitudes to what was happening in France. So Pitt the Younger who became Prime Minister after the American War, was then the head of a faction that remained fairly solidly in power until 1830, which became the Tory party again. But what defined them was hostility, Burkean hostility, to what was happening in France, and readiness to use repressive measures at home against Jacobin sympathizers of what was seen as a pressing foreign enemy. And the Whig party, Burke's own party, the Rockinghamites and Foxites, were much more initially sympathetic to the French Revolution. It was only really when they saw the full consequences that they, and even then rather grudgingly, admitted that they got it wrong and kept, and throughout were still pushing for easier peace terms. Now, what does that say about Burke coming from a majoritarian Irish Catholic background? Well, it's really important to understand the nature of English and Scottish anti-Catholicism in the 17th and early 18th century. Right? It was overwhelmingly not doctrinal, it was not dogmatic, it was much more geopolitical. In other words, people didn't really care about the transubstantiation or whether you prayed for the souls of the dead. The concern was that if the semi-permanent war with France and Spain ended in an invasion, whose side would English Catholics be on? J.P. Kenyon, the great historian, likened it to the Cold War. He said there was an external threat that was so severe that even democratic socialists who had no sympathy with Soviet tyranny were bound to come under suspicion because they were too close. And in exactly the same way, wrongly, by the way, as even the great Whig historian Trevelyan admitted, English and Scottish Catholic gentry were always under a cloud of suspicion, really until the American War. The numbers in which English, Scottish, and particularly Irish Catholics volunteered to fight for the crown in the American Revolution removed any taint of disloyalty. The phrase of the time was they proved their loyalty, right? The charge of divided loyalties was impossible to reconcile with the lengthy lists of Catholic war dead on the memorials. Burke, I think, saw the French Revolution as a way of reinterpreting how people thought. So if you had, just prolonging that Kenyan Cold War analogy for a moment, the fear of the English or Scottish Whig from the late 17th to the late 18th century, if you'd expressed it in the form of a map, it would have been a big arrow going from Spain to Ireland, and then a smaller arrow, two smaller arrows coming from Ireland to the Scottish Highlands and to Lancashire. This was where the fifth column was thought to be, right? And Burke understood that the French Revolution would flip people's minds, would flip people's attitudes to foreign policy. That now that there was this secular and anti-clerical enemy, and that the chief enemy of that national rival was the Catholic Church in France, indeed the Catholic Church in the rest of Europe, that Catholicism could be rehabilitated in the minds of English Whigs. As indeed it basically was, right? That we had the Catholic Relief Act in 1795, and Burke lived long enough and warmly supported the establishment of Maynooth, which I understand we're going to visit this afternoon rather appropriately. So it worked.
To anticipate a fun fact, while it was established, more parliamentary time was spent debating the Maynooth Grant than the repeal of the Corn Laws.
Yes.
Now, I want to question...
Or building the seminary.
Here's a question for the philosopher. Hannah Arendt, in the famous Gauss interview, he starts off by calling her a philosopher. He says, no, I've left philosophy behind. She said, philosophy, since Plato, cannot be neutral when it comes to politics. And philosophers, with the exception of Kant, and I'll take her word for it, I've never understood, is hostile to politics. Now, Burke is not hostile to politics. On the contrary, Burke is back. What is Burke? I mean, one of the things that happens with Burke is you have this squabbling. I mean, with the exception of a few people, Mary Shelley, Mr. Marx, the German historian, and his colleague, Mr. Engels, and then Tony Benn. Even people who are on different sides recognize Burke as a huge talent, as a genius or whatever. But there were different debates at different times. Was he a practical thinker? Was he a metaphysical thinker? what was he? Debates about was he a positivist, was he a Benthamite, was he a utilitarian, whatever. But what is he a philosopher? Is what Burke does, is it philosophy? Is it political theory? Is it a kind of history of a constitution? What is it that he does?
Well, I think that Burke can be considered a political philosopher, and actually a profound one, because he articulated the British political tradition even better than Locke and Hume and Smith. And this great insight that the social contract is a partnership between the dead, the living, and the coming generations is extraordinary. I would like to say that a lot of my classical liberal friends, they do not like participating in politics, and I disagree with them. And I would like to bring your attention to the fact that the three, not only Burke, who was a member of parliament, but the three Nordic thinkers that I was describing, they were all active in politics. Snorri Sturluson, he was the law speaker of Iceland twice. He was the richest man in Iceland, and he was the only official of the Icelandic Commonwealth. Anders Chydenius was a member of the Swedish Diet and very successful there, and a friend of the king and quite a player in Sweden. Grundtvig was also a member of the Constituent Assembly of Denmark that gave Denmark a liberal constitution in 1849, and he was a member of the Danish parliament. So none of them try to be above politics. I think that it's our civic duty to participate in politics, and in his famous contrast of the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns, Benjamin Constant said that commerce was wonderful, that it unleashed all kinds of forces, creative powers and so on, but the problem was that it might discourage people from participation in politics, from doing their civic duty, which is to participate in politics. This would be my answer to that. But I would like to give a few remarks about those very interesting questions that Dan Hannan was responding to. One is about the church. I think that for Burke, the main point was to support the established church in each country, which would mean the Catholic Church in France and the Presbyterians in Scotland and the Anglican Church in England. Why was that? That's because the church was a bastion of stability and continuity. And this was also Grundtvig's idea, even if Grundtvig was different from Burke in actively welcoming congregations outside the established Danish church. But why was that? Because congregations, as well as associations and so on, they give people meaning, a sense of belonging. And that's what has been lacking in a lot of classical liberal theory. The very idea that we are not only individuals. I applaud individuality and individual choice. That Romeo and Julia, they decide to marry each other instead of just following their two families. That's fine, that's individualism. But we all want to be members of a community, to belong to something, to have a meaning in life. And Grundtvig thought so about congregations, free congregations, and associations. And both he and Chydenius, they were priests actually. And why is religion, why should we have sympathy with religion like the Christian religion as a conservative liberals? I think it is because it will instill in us humility, and that's what we need. There is so little that we know, each of us. So how are we going to live in a civilization? It is by utilizing the knowledge of everybody else. This is beautifully described by Hayek, and I think that the Christian equivalent of this is humility before the God, and for the economists like Hayek, it is our awareness of our inevitable ignorance that can only be overcome by the price mechanism and free trade in the present, and by availing ourselves of the wisdom of generations over time. So that's what I was going to say about established religion, but I can't resist, if I can.
Briefly, because I would like to get the audience.
Sure, to say something about India. is there any such thing as India? I think it is a total construct. There was Hyderabad and the Mysore and all kinds of principalities and so on. And I think that the greatest mistake was not to allow all of these to be independent states instead of accumulating all in one big entity that was then controlled for decades by a dynasty, the Gandhi Nehru dynasty that held down the abilities of the Indian peoples.
Okay, does anybody, I have plenty of questions, but I feel I should ask. Please.
I would like to continue on the topic of Nordic liberalism. And some would argue that Sweden, where I come from, wasn't even feudal society because of the laws of property and estate and so. Would you agree on that, or?
Absolutely, and you see, Carl Bildt, he once gave a very interesting speech about this, and he said, the fact about Sweden is that there was never a feudal system there, never adscription or anything like that. And the ideal of the independent farmer, which you have in the poems of Geir and others, is just wonderful. It's an aura of individuality. It's a total misunderstanding that Sweden is a collectivistic society by heritage. There has been strong collectivistic flavor in the 20th century. But I will throw out one theory now. The liberal or the traditional liberty in Sweden is strong enough that it has withstood both the assault of the kings that tried to establish absolute power in the 17th and 18th century, and the Social Democrats who are also trying to establish absolute power in the 20th century.
That gentleman?
Yes, I have a question for both of the gentlemen about the little platoons. You already mentioned the church as a little platoon, and Professor, you mentioned that this is a place where people have a sense of belonging. Burke also mentioned other little platoons like the family and the local community, and he is in line with Aristotle. These are the places where people learn virtues, and this is actually where life begins, and those are essential, fundamental for flourishing for a society. And in the sociology, we call this social institutions. They are really important for the social cohesion and social capital and traditions of a society. But nowadays, we see that those little platoons are declining or under attack because of some forces like secularism, globalization, bureaucracy, for example.
So if we could get to the question.
And the question is, how can we, in this century, promote and protect or revitalize those little platoons? And is that possible with those kind of forces?
Prayer.
So you're absolutely right in your diagnosis. I mentioned when I was talking that the Cold War finished just after I read this. It's amazing how long the geopolitical alignments of the Cold War have lasted, right? If you look at who backs Russia now, Russia is now supposedly an orthodox and nationalist rather than an atheist and communist state, but who are its allies? Syria, Cuba, Nicaragua, the Chinese, every totalitarian state. Why? Because with the exception of Europe, including the Baltic states, that had some democratic muscle memory to fall back on, the destruction of those little platoons made it almost impossible to build a post-totalitarian state in a lot of those places. When János Kádár was the interior minister of Hungary just after the communist coup, his first job was to destroy every civic association between the government and the citizen. Every Boy Scouts group, every tennis club, every church choir, every stamp collecting group, 5,000 institutions either had to become part of the party or be destroyed completely. And that's the real legacy of communism, that they destroy that space. They leave us atomized and alone. And so what do we do to bring it back? Well, the answer is contained in the framing of the question, right? The reason that the Burkean platoons were diminished was because the state squeezed them out. That the authority of the head of the family, the headmaster, the clergyman, the respectable local organic leader of a society was squeezed out to make room for the growing authority of the clerk, the regulator, the licenser, the bureaucrat. Withdraw them, and you recreate a space for civil society.
Yannis, very briefly, because we have one more question, then we have to have coffee.
Yes, just is that there is a flourishing civil society in the European countries, and we should just try to maintain and protect it, and use the tax system, for example, to enable people to bring up their children instead of having to send them to kindergarten, and use them for private schools and other such things. So I think the task of conservative parties is to cultivate and nourish civil society, the space between the state and the individual. And this is precisely what Tocqueville explained as the cause of the French Revolution, that the kings had squeezed out, as Hannan puts it, squeezed out everything between the individual and the state.
Okay, last one.
First, a quick note of thanks to the panel for an insightful and informative conversation. The question, if Burke was alive today, how would he, or is there any insights he might share on a future relationship between Ireland and the UK, in light of things like Brexit, an increasingly bureaucratic Europe?
That's so difficult to answer. Mary Wollstonecraft said, if you'd been born French, maybe you'd have been a revolutionary, right? Your passion, and which I think is wrong, but I kind of see where she was coming from, right? Had he been born 30 years later, might he not, I mean, it never occurred to him that that being Irish didn't also mean British, or couldn't also mean British. But to him, that issue just didn't arise. He was a strong opponent of the, as I said, of the United Irishmen. Not least, he disliked what he saw as the dissenting radical Presbyterian element of it, right? He thought that was ill-mannered. Very unlike his attitude to the American Revolution, where he said, well, actually, you know, they've just taken their Protestantism to the logical destination of not wanting kings telling them what to do. He thought that whole thing was unnatural. Had he been born later, I don't know. I'm going to say, I always think this is my single most unpopular view in a crowded field. I've spent 20 years in politics accumulating lots of unpopular positions, but I'm going to say this, and I suspect Burke would have agreed, but I can't swear to it. Had the great counterfactual, had any of the Home Rule bills passed, my guess is that we would have been spared 3 wars. The War of Independence, obviously, and the Irish Civil War, and, if you count the Troubles as a long, slow burn war on the other side of the border, right? It could have very easily happened had there not been this unbelievable response to the Easter Rising by the authorities. Most people would have expected it to happen. Complete republicanism was a very fringe position before 1916. And I don't think it is fanciful to imagine Ireland, which had the same sort of population as, I don't know, New Zealand or somewhere, evolving peacefully towards autonomy. Maybe not exactly in the same way as New Zealand, because geography is different, but a great deal of death and suffering would have been spared. Was it needless death after all, says Yeats? I think horribly, yes, it was.
It's an interesting thought experiment. Burke in Brussels. What would he have done? I think he would have focused on the 2 engines of centralization, which are the European Commission and the European Court of Justice. And what he would have done would have been to divide the Court of Justice into 2 courts. One of them would have been a court of subsidiarity, establishing very firmly the subsidiarity principle, namely to make decisions at the lowest possible level and then let another court decide on legal issues. And the European Commission should have been turned into a civil service and deprived of its power to legislate. So that's what a Burke coming in Brussels would have done very briefly, but we all have to enjoy our coffee, so I'm not going to elaborate on this.
So I would like to thank Lord Hannan and Hannes Gissurarson, Professor, anyway, very much for their contribution. I've enjoyed it tremendously. I hope you have too. And now, coffee and muffins.